Hello, welcome again. This channel is called Aldsidu, Ald meaning old, Sidu meaning customs. In today's topic, did the Germanic Scandinavian heathens celebrate a new year? Now, most of you guys have heard me say this before. Most people in modern Asatru do not read the Eddas, they do not read the Sagas. If they do any research, it's on Google or Bing and Yahoo, and there's so much misinformation on the World Wide Web today that most make a lot of assumptions. So as we all know, that solstices and equinoxes are often assumed in modern heathenry and paganism. And yet we have no sources that come out and just flat out state, hey, there's a major blow on a solstice or equinox. Now, I am going to discuss Bede in an upcoming slide, so I'm not running away from him. But with the exception of Bede, which we can easily discuss Bede because it's, I'll get there, but we'll discuss Bede later. He's the one exception. Now, heathens had 4 seasons, is what many people assume. Some who do not research realize that winter and summer are the only 2 heathen seasons in the sources. But almost all do not read the sources. Winter and summer had midpoints. So, right here in the slide, that's not a statement of fact. That's what people assume. Heathens had 2 seasons historically with midpoints. They had winter and summer. And the 7-day week is so ingrained with most people, they cannot accept that heathens had days of the moon and that Christianity brought a 7-day week. The idea that there's an Elohim or an all-powerful God who created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, that is absolutely something that was brought into Europe. And there is misunderstanding of Bede in Proto-Indo-European studies and linguistics that cause misunderstandings, which I'm going to get into. So I'm going to break precedent. I'm going to go right into Proto-Indo-European studies. I haven't taught P before, but I'm going to today. So Jupiter equals Zeus. I mean, most people know this, but yet when they look at the word Jupiter and they look at the word Zeus, they think there's no way that they can be linguistically tied. Jupiter in Latin is Jupiter. However, putting it in its Proto-Indo-European form, it's Jus Pater, and Jus meaning sky, and Pater meaning father. Therefore, Zeus and Jupiter can now more easily be aligned. And remember, I'm not a professional linguist, so I apologize about my probable mispronunciation. But D is often in Proto-Indo-European has a DJ or a DZ sound. And we have Diauspiter, the Sky Father, in Sanskrit. So if we have Zeus in Rome, Jupiter in Rome, Zeus in Greece, and we have a Sanskrit deity, Diauspiter, that are all linguistically tied, we do have evidence of, the same gods in modern day Italy, modern day Greece, modern day India, modern day Iran. So starting in the 1700s, scholars started to notice these very ancient similarities and dubbed the similarities the Proto-Indo-European language family. Now, can we reconstruct a Proto-Indo-European language and religion? Scholars have been trying to do this, but this is largely based on theories. This is a prehistoric language, and there is no written evidence that the ground is unearthed that shows us the Proto-Indo-European language. This was a language that was spoken before 2000 BCE. So in other words, this ended 3,000 years before heathenry was wiped out in Scandinavia. So again, I do think Proto-Indo-European studies are very important. There are certain things that we can learn from it, but at the same point in time, what happened before 2000 BCE is kind of often irrelevant to what's going on 3,000 years later. So scholars are using, through linguistics, they're using P to reconstruct P words. And one of the downfalls of this is that P obviously had to have many dialects, and yet scholars are reconstructing just one P language. So Old Saxon scholar Dr. Scott Shell tells me often that Old Saxon had dialects. That is very true. The Westphalians could speak with the Eastphalians, but they probably had some dialect terms that they could still understand each other. But it's kind of like me talking to a Someone in the South, they're going to have a Southern drawl accent, and I clearly was raised in the North in America. So, we all speak the same language in America today. Well, a lot of us do, but English it does even have different pronunciations and different accents within our own country, and the same thing was true with this Proto-Indo-European language. And I don't mean to be a smart sass here, but seriously, why stop at Proto-Indo-European? This is not the first language. Why not also include pre-Proto-Indo-European and pre-Proto-Indo-European, and so on and so forth? Or just go back to the origins of human speech itself. P did not just pop into existence from nothing. Why not keep going back? Well, this is as far back as linguists can go, sadly. Again, this is prehistory as it is, and getting into prehistory is a very difficult thing. So Mallory and Adams on page 40, they state the P homeland is an interesting question, but it is so difficult to resolve and requires the application of so many less than robust means of argument that most archaeologists and historical linguists do not find it a worthwhile enterprise, at least for themselves. So I'll show you that book shortly, but Mallory and Adams are P scholars who are involved in reconstructing the Proto-Indo-European language. And they state very clearly that the Proto-Indo-European homeland, they can't even prove exactly where it is. How far north in Europe did it go is a very pertinent question to those of us trying to reconstruct Germanic heathenry 3,000 years older than Proto-Indo-European studies. So the point of all this is that P can be very helpful, but it is more of a reconstructed language and its homeland is not identified. People assume P and they do not research it. One example is Stonehenge. People tell me Stonehenge all the time. This is Proto-Indo-European. Therefore, the Germanic peoples had to venerate on the solstice because Stonehenge proves that peoples knew when the solstice was. Well, the people who built Stonehenge weren't Germanic. And I'm not arguing that Germanic heathens did not know the approximate time of the solstice. I'm just arguing that Yule was not on the solstice, nor was it the new year. So again, this is a great book. I'd encourage those who are studying to get it, but here's the Mallory and Adams book. So as I said before, Stonehenge is interesting, but most Anasatrue are trying to reconstruct Norse or Nordic religion, 2,000, 3,000 years after Stonehenge. Now, lunar solar calendars were used by the Germanic tribes. So for those to work, the Germanic peoples did know at least the approximate time of the solstice at a bare minimum. But this doesn't mean that celestial events that the naked eye cannot see, unlike the full moons, were the holidays and the celebrations. Old religions of P, like the Hebrew Bible, do not have New Year celebrations. Now I know people are going to say, now Judaism has a Rosh Hashanah. But if you read Exodus chapters 4 through 12, Rabbinical Judaism did to the Hebrew Bible what the Catholic Church did to the Latin or the Greek New Testament. They created a Latin Bible that contradicts it. Exodus chapters 4 through 12 state very clearly that the head of the Hebrew year is in the springtime. The word Aviv is the first moon of the Hebrew calendar, and that first month occurs when the barley is green in Israel. So modern Judaism uses a lunisolar calendar, but biblical Judaism uses a luna-agricultural calendar. After 12 moons happen, come the beginning of the 13th moon, if the barley isn't ripe in Israel yet, they're going to insert a 13th moon. So in that case, it's not even a lunar solar calendar, it's lunar agricultural. See especially Exodus chapter 12. And the Hebrew day, like the Germanic day, begins at sundown. So there are a lot more parallels with P in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, Christianity doesn't count for many reasons. It's far later. But the Hebrew holidays like Passover was on a full moon. The Feast of Sukkot started on a full moon, or For those who don't know what Sukkot means, that's the Feast of Tabernacles in English. So, you know, and they did special sacrifices in the temple on every new moon. So certainly in the Hebrew Bible, the new moons and the full moons is what matters. Now, a lot of people argue with me. They're like, hey, you know, of course it's solstices and equinoxes. You're a complete moron, followed by a bunch of swear words or whatever. But here's this great book by Dr. Andreas E. Zoutner, The Lunisolar Calendar of the Germanic Peoples. Dr. Andreas Zoutner and Dr. Andreas Nordberg, those are my two favorite Swedish scholars. They have studied the archaeological rune staffs and prime staff calendar rods, proving that Yule and the solstice were at two different times, and that the Yule for the pre-Germanic or pre-Christian peoples was on the full moon. So, and one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Zoutner's book, he says, if we browse the internet for holidays of the Germanic people, we find mainly pages presenting an octopartate year cycle, the so-called eight-spoke wheel of the year based on the solstices, the equinoxes, and 4 moon feasts in between. This year cycle has absolutely no historical basis, although it is very popular in neo-pagan circles, especially within Wicca and eclectic Asatru. There's no verified evidence for such a year cycle as basis for the seasonal festivities. The same is true for the Celtic feast within the year circle, because the Gauls too used a lunisolar calendar, as we know from the examples of the Coligny and the Villiards. So, and he continues, if one internalized such ideas, one should get rid of them immediately, meaning get rid of the eight-spoked Wiccan wheel of the year. There is no historical basis, according to the scholars, for an eight-spoked solar wheel of the year that looks at only solar events, ignores the moons, and puts 8 solar events on a wheel. There is no historical basis that that happened historically. So, I kind of put at the bottom, Wicca, Wicca, Wicca. I guess I'm going to go backwards on this slide. But, you know, Wicca and Christianity have influenced modern Asatru more than historical pre-Christian Germanic heathenry does. And I don't mean that to be a dig, but it's just the case. Just like today, modern rabbinical Judaism follows the Talmud more than it follows the actual written Bible itself. The same thing is true with Asatru, that Wicca and Christianity, often things are borrowed from them back into it. We don't decolonize and get the worldview of the ancient heathens enough in neo-paganism today. So let's start discussing Bede, because Bede does mention the 25th of December. And that was the solstice on the Julian calendar. Now, Bede is the only one that does this. I guess technically Hakon the Good. There's that saga that mentions that Yule was moved to the solstice as part of forced Christianization. There's that. But Bede, in De Temporum Rationae, chapters 15, he discusses something called Mother's Night. Now, Mother's Night and Yule are two different things. Bede never states that Mother's Night is Yule, and yet all the Anglo-Saxon heathens who argue with me, many agree with me, but and many are a part of Aldsidu, but there's a lot that are not a part of Aldsidu that argue, and they claim that Mother's Night is Yule, but Bede doesn't say that. And Bede only says Mother's Night is one singular night. Now, Bede drives me a little bit crazy because he's comparing heathen Oster to the Christian Passover. Easter was called Passover in the church in Bede's time, and Bede compares Mother's Night to Christmas. So Bede can't stop talking about his Christianity even when he's discussing the pagan calendar of the Angles. And Bede contradicts himself, which I'm going to get to on the next slide. I mean, Bede in De Temporum Rationae, chapter 15, at one point he says the Angles had 4 seasons, and then he says the Angles had 2 seasons. I mean, he even contradicts himself in his own passage. Why? Because he's talking about both the Roman year in his time, and he's talking about the pagan year, and he's mixing the two together. And it's also Bede, he was born and raised in a monastery. He doesn't know the heathens. He may have learned some things about heathenry, whether he went out and talked to one or whether he did some research from the monks, but Bede is clearly Christianized, and the calendar that he's giving is clearly Christianized. And that's why he talks about comparing Mother's Night to Christmas and comparing Oster to the Christian Passover later called Easter. And that's why it's getting mixed up. The Angles had 4 seasons versus the Angles having 2 seasons. So, Bede also comes out and states, he's the only one that states that there's a new year. We're going to get into this on later slides, but while the Norse sources state that the bloat on winter nights is a bloat for a good year, and we do have evidence that they felt that the year began in October on a full moon. And even Bede himself says that, by the way. He says that winter begins on a full moon. But no Norse source really cares about a New Year as a bloat in and of itself. The New Year is very important for Christians and for Muslims and for Jews, and they number these years. If you look at a calendar today, the Jews, their calendars all have a year to it. So we're in like the year 5600 something, almost 5700 something since the world was created in the Jewish calendar. And we're 2023 years after Christ in the heathen calendar, in the church calendar of today that we use today. 2023 is AD, it's after Christ, so to speak, after Domini, after the Lord's birth. Christianity, Judaism, and Abrahamic religions count years, but I don't see heathens counting years. And I do have to point out, in Bede's time, the actual solstice was around the 17th or the 18th, not on December 25th. So this creates even more problems when studying Bede, because Bede just comes out and says, well, the Angles did their New Year on the same date as we do Christmas, the 8th calends of January, which is December 25th. Bede never answers why he thinks the Angles knew of Julian calendar dates. And they clearly didn't, because they were heathens. They weren't a part of the church. They could care less when they were heathens how the Christian church from Rome handled their calendar. And Pope Julian with his calendar, they could care less. And by the way, what's going on in heathenry today, just as Bede couldn't get away from Xmas and Mother's Night and Easter and versus the Christian Passover, we have this today. Yule and Ostara is the Asatru, Xmas, and Easter. And I really think that, again, Christianity and Wicca have more bearing on modern heathenry than the actual historical studies. So let's compare Bede versus the Germanic sources. I mean, what does Tacitus say? The community gathers if nothing unusual or sudden happens at certain times when the moon is new or full, because they consider this the luckiest beginning to discuss matters. Also, they do not calculate the number of days, but the number of nights. In this way, they state purpose and commitment. Night precedes the day. So according to Tacitus and his Germania, and Tacitus is a Roman pagan, he's not a Roman Christian, I mean, he's implying that Germanic tribes are actually more Proto-Indo-European. They were, lunisolar, full moons and new moons. He's not saying the luckiest times to gather on solstices and equinoxes. He doesn't say that at all. Tacitus clearly states that it's new and full moons. So again, Tacitus did not say solstices and equinoxes. He said new and full moons. And even Bede states this as well, and Bede kind of contradicts himself. He states that the moon by which the Angles began their winter season was called Winterfilleth, a name compounded of the terms for winter and full moon, because from the full moon of that moon, winter was thought to begin. Now, this is a smoking gun, in my opinion, because if a season begins on a full moon, then its ending point and the beginning of the next season is on a full moon. And the midpoints are all full moons. So what I haven't had a good explanation of yet from those who argue with me with Bede is, if you believe winter started in mid to late October on a full moon, and 2 months later-ish is the solstice in December, then between the solstice in December till a full moon in April. I mean, the solstice is not halfway in between a full moon in October and April. So how can a new year begin on a solstice, and how can a midpoint be a solstice if the seasons start and end on full moons? And the answer is they can't. So again, this is a contradiction when Bede says the Angles began their year in the 8th calends of January, when we celebrate the birth of the Lord. That very night, which we hold so sacred, they used to call by the heathen word Matronae, that is, mothers, plural possessive, night, singular, because of the ceremonies they enacted all that night. That is interesting on several levels. One, in Bede's time, the solstice was not on December 25th. So for the Angles to be celebrating Christmas, or Mother's Night, on the same night the church is doing Christmas, means that both are keeping the Julian calendar. I actually think it would be more likely that the Angles would keep the solstice, because it's impossible that on that very night they would be, because the night of December 25th in Bede's time was a week off from the actual solstice. The Julian calendar got one full day off from the actual solstice every 120 years. That's why in October 1582, the Julian calendar was replaced with the Gregorian calendar, because, you know, it was 11 days off at that time, and they needed to correct it. So Bede gives us problems, and I'm not saying he gives me problems, because Mother's Night is not Yule, so it's not a problem for me, but I absolutely do not believe that the heathen Angles were celebrating something on the very night of Christmas. I do believe that it is possible that they celebrated their Mother's Night on the solstice, and I'm going to get back to that later. But I can't state enough, too, that Mother's Night is a singular night. It's mother's possessive plural, so it's Mother's Night. And Bede doesn't say that it's Yule, and he states that it's one night. And this is contrary to Norse sources that state pre-Christian Yule was 3 days. And even the Germanic words, Weihnachten, the modern word for Christmas, is a plural word. Weihnachten means sacred grove, nights, plural. So is it possible that in England they had an extra holiday in addition to Yule that lasted one night? I certainly think that it is. So how can the Angles celebrate December 25th, the Julian calendar? Did they know the Julian calendar? Why would December 25th be the new year in heathenry? What do the Norse sources state? Now, one thing I didn't really discuss yet is that in Bede's time, Christmas Day was New Year's Day. Originally, March 25th was New Year's Day, but it was switched to December 25th. And it remained December 25th, not only long before Bede was born, but until the adoption of the Gregorian calendar. December 25th and New Year's Day was the same day. So I'm going to get to it. I believe it's in a later slide where the Frankish annals claim Charlemagne was crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 801, but history books claim he was crowned emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800. Because in Charlemagne's time, he was actually crowned in the year 801, because Christmas and New Year's Day used to be the same day. The New Year was also the day of Christ's birth, even though it wasn't the first day of the month. So, I announce it right here. So again, before Bede's time and long after Bede, New Year's Day was December 25th. And it appears to me that, like Bede is saying 4 seasons and then 2 seasons, Bede is clearly talking about the New Year's Day. Because when we get into the Norse sources, no ifs, ands, or buts, the new year began with the start of winter. And that's when their Deciblet was. So, very important. So Ynglinga Saga states, Odin established the same law in his land that had been in force in Asaland, or Asgard. On Winter Day, which is the first day of winter, there will be a blot for a good year. So, is the big deal is that it's a new year? Or is that it's the first day of winter? I would say I'm getting ahead of myself because I'm going to conclude that New Year's Day was not important to pre-Christian heathens. What was important is that the first day of winter, while it was the start of a new year in a sense for them, the more important part was they were doing their Disa bloat. They were doing their house bloat as well for their harvests. And they were bloating for a good year, but it wasn't a big party for a good year. It was a Disa bloat, it was a house bloat, and the winter fillet bloat, or winter nights bloat, for a good year in general. So that's what really the emphasis is, because the Norse sources never come out and state, hey, this is New Year's Day. Why? Because in pre-Christian heathenry, the fact that it was a new year was not a big deal. Just like in Christianity, Sunday, it's a new week. It's not that big of a deal. It's a big deal that Jesus rose from the dead, I guess, on Sunday. But the fact that we've gone from one week to another week isn't a big deal. And again, for these people, the Germanic peoples, they did bloats on new moons. I believe this is pretty clear from the sources. We see the Hebrews in the Hebrew Bible doing it. We see other Proto-Indo-Europeans doing bloats on new moons, but we don't see it going on solstices, not until later. So I really think New Year's Day was not a big deal to them. It was a bigger deal that winter was beginning. It was the harvest season. That's really what matters. Now, again, I can give several slides, but here's a slide of this is post-Christian in terms of the moon names, but even a newly Christian Iceland stated that their year began in mid-October and that they had 2 seasons. So the Norse sources do agree with this. The Sagas, the Eddas, their moon names that we find within them do agree with the later, some of them do, not all, with the later Misery calendar. I have a video on the Misery calendar if you want to look it up. But clearly, the year begins in October. And this slide I took right off Wikipedia. And I know that Wikipedia isn't the best site in the world, but this is actually correct. You'll find this, look up the Icelandic Misery calendar, and you'll see that their year begins with Jolmanuthr in mid-October. So that is absolutely correct. And it doesn't appear to me, as I said before, that heathens counted the years the way that the Jews do, the Samaritans do, and the Christian do, and the modern world does. You know, heathens did count their age. They had the word winter yatalu, winter years. They counted their age by the numbers of winters they lived. And I do really think Bede is discussing 2 calendars, and that's what's going on. We have the heathen lunisolar calendar, which Bede states that they were lunisolar, and he gives the moon names. And I conclude that stating that New Year's Day was not an important concept in old ways, historical pre-Christian heathenry. Bede's statement of Xmas being New Year's Day, celebrating mothers, is a contradiction to the Norse sources calling winter nights a Disa bloat and a bloat for the new year. And again, New Year's Day is a bigger deal to Christians and Romans than it is to heathens. So we definitely know that for sure. Now, Bede does contradict himself. So here's the whole Bede passage. The peoples who welcomed in the year in this method also assigned 3 moons to each season of the year. So he then says that the Germanic people had 3 moons to each season, which is wrong. And he'll contradict himself again. But he says whenever an envelism occurred, when a 13th lunar moon happens, they added it to the summer, so that in that case there's 3 moons in accession were called letha. Such year was known as triletha, having 4 moons in summer and 3 each of the other seasons. But here's where he contradicts us. He says the division of the year, though, was in 2 seasons, winter and summer. So which is it? Is it 2 or is it 4? Summer comprising 6 or 7 moons when the days were longer than nights, and winters 6 moons when the nights were longer than the days. Thus, the moon by which they began their season was called winter filleth, a name compounded of the terms for winter and full moon, because on the full moon of that moon, winter was thought to begin. So Bede is clearly talking about the Roman 4 seasons, and then he's switching to the Germanic 2 seasons. Now, I understand that the Germanic seasons do have midpoints. So, winter filleth in October, 3 full moons later. In January is going to be the full moon of Yule Moon in January. And then 3 full moons later is going to be Osterblot or Sigurblot to the Scandinavians. But you can see that Bede contradicts himself within his own writings, where he's saying that there's 4 seasons and then he's saying that there's 2 seasons. And again, the fact that he's comparing Mother's Night to Christmas is huge for me, and that he's comparing Mother's Night to the Roman New Year, which is also Christmas at the time, is huge for me. And I haven't seen any Anglo-Saxon heathens who argue with me admit that. And here's another slide of the Icelandic year. Though it's upside down, the year begins over here, not really in April, but you can see that the beginning of winter, over here the word winter is crossed out, is in late October, close to November, and that summer begins in early April. So, my point before about it not being half points, if the full moon in October is here and we get to December and the solstice is here, that means you've got 2/3 of the season is after the midpoint, which is completely impossible, which is why we know that Mother's Night and Yule are 2 different nights. Now, Bede versus Tacitus versus the Germanic sources. So Dr. Andreas Nordberg, the world's foremost scholar on the Norse holy days, makes clear in his book on the dating of Yule that the pre-Christian Yule feast occurs at the first full moon after the first new moon following the winter solstice, while the distinct took place at the 3rd full moon according to the same method of calculation. So, and there's his book on the dating of Yule. The Chronicon of Thietmar of Merseburg, he wrote, "As I have heard stories concerning their ancient midwinter sacrifices, I will not allow this custom to be ignored. The middle of that kingdom is called Letteren or Lera, in the region of Sealand. All the people gathered every 9 years in January, that is after we celebrated the birth of our Lord, and there they offered to their gods sacrifices." Now, Thietmar of Merseburg, while he is Germanic, he's actually Greek Orthodox, so he's saying that Yule was actually after January 6th. Though this year, Yule was January 6th going into the 7th. Yule was very early this year. And of course we have the Saga of Hakon the Good, which is the story of Hakon the Good converting Norway to be heathen. So Hakon the Good was a good Christian when he came to Norway, but as the whole country was heathen with much heathen sacrifice, and as many great people, as well as the favor of the common people, were to be conciliated, he resolved to practice his Christianity in private, but he kept Sundays, the Friday fast, and some token of the greatest holidays. He made a law that the festival Yule should begin at the same time as the Christian people held it, and that every man under penalty should brew a meal of malt into ale, and therewith keep the Yule holy as long as it lasted. Formally, the first night of Yule was Hokenot, that is midwinter night, and Yule was held for 3 nights. So what's going on here? So Hakon the Good's father was the first king of all Norway, Harald Fairhair, and he was the second oldest. So when his brother became king, his brother was heathen, he fled to England to be educated by the monks there. And when his brother died, he came back. So he came back to Norway, and naturally Norway was heathen with much heathen bloat. And then he tried, because he was a Christian, to move Yule. And Yule and Christmas were, they were trying to make them at the same exact time. And the Christians were trying to hold Christmas on the solstice. But of course, they got a few days off at that time. So I also want to state that we have 2 very important books by Alex G. Garman, The Cult of the Matronae in Roman Rhineland, a historical evaluation of the archaeological evidence, and Pagan Goddesses in the Germanic World, Osterreda and the Cult of the Matrons. So you can see both of these talk about the Matronae cult. These doctors believe that Mother's Night is not even a Germanic holiday, that it was brought with the Roman troops, and they brought it into Britannia when the Romans conquered it, and that's what the Matronae cult is, which does explain why Yule and Mother's Night are 2 different nights. So please join us on the Facebook group Aldsidu Saxon Heathenry. Please like and subscribe to this channel. Thank you so much, and glad you listened.